Going over the first section of chapter 4, which is on sound recording and popular music. So kind of following the themes from previous chapters, I'll just kind of start with an intro, and then this first section is going to step us through the evolution from emergence through to mass media and convergence of sound as a popular medium. Now, this is the first chapter in the section on sound and images, so it's the first chapter of the second section of our book. So one of the things to keep in mind as we're going through to convergence is that any and all media are now going to be consumed via the internet. So all of the technology that we just talked about in terms of being able to access things, those are going to be used in order to consume the media that we're talking about in this section. And traditional media corporations are going to be playing catch up. We're going to be looking at how this new technology disrupts systems and how new technology is being used by large corporations in order to take advantage of these disruptions. A lot of these things are going to be coming at us in the 20th century. We'll see that in a lot of areas we're kind of setting things up in the 19th century. We're going to be primed for change and technological change in the 20th century. And then in the 21st, we get our convergence. And how do we bring all of that together? So how are we going to be experiencing media starting at the beginning of 2001 on through today? Now, when we're looking at sound, particularly sound recording, which then becomes the kind of boom of music as a form of entertainment, we're going to go through similar stages in terms of our emergence, where we're starting to see changes in how people are able to access these things, entrepreneurial time when people are finding out how to get it into our homes, how to make money off of it, things becoming a mass medium, and then convergence. And there are a few technological changes that kind of drive this. But if we're looking at sound recording, and the ability for us to capture audio and to then play it back later, we really don't see that happening until the mid-19th century. And it starts off in France, and then in the US, we have Edison kind of building off of what's happening over in Europe, and he kind of begins the entrepreneurial stage. Edison was very good at finding emerging technologies and figuring out ways to make money off of them. And your book goes through various versions of the phonograph that are kind of brought through production in the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. But it isn't until we get Victrola at the beginning of the 20th century that we start being able to get it into people's homes. We start being able to actually capitalize and be able to make things on a scale that allows us to actually have it go beyond one-offs. And at this point, we are using a technology that isn't particularly faithful to what the original recording was. In fact, Victrola were the ones who had the popular ad, His Master's Voice, which was that you had your phonograph recording of someone's voice, and they played it back, and the dog recognized it and barked at it. And at this point, the idea of recording sound wasn't for music. It was mostly people thought that they were going to be recording our voices for speaking, things like this. But it isn't until we get into the 20th century and into kind of the early mid-20th century that people start thinking about it as a way of hearing music back. And in terms of recording, that doesn't happen until the 1940s. We'll talk about radio, but that was how we were then transmitting audio into people's homes. But using sound recording as a way of distributing music wasn't very popular at the beginning of the 20th century. When we get vinyl records in the 1940s, we start being able to more mass produce this in people's homes. So they might have had a phonograph in your home, but they weren't you wouldn't necessarily use that for listening to music the way that we think of using a record player, a CD player, or our digital devices for listening to music. So when we get into the mid-20th century, that's when you start having music being distributed widely, and we kind of start standardizing formats. And we start having formats that don't degrade quite as quickly over time. Phonographs were not exactly the truest for that. So in the 1940s, into the turn of the 1950s, we start having what we consider LP records. 33 1/3, which if you are a fan of reading about music, there is a great series of books that kind of break down seminal music recordings, and it's called 33 1/3. And then we have 45 RPMs. And those differences are, again, kind of differences in speeds of how things are going to play on your turntable. If you are the type of person who has a turntable, you will know about the little adapters that you get so that you have things spin at the right speed. So as you can kind of see here, it takes about 100 years for stuff to go from emergence to being a mass medium that's in people's homes. We're not going to hit convergence for almost another 50 years. So at this point, we're in that kind of mass medium time period, and we have other technologies that are going to go from emergence to mass medium within sound recording during that kind of 50-year span. So as we're getting into mass media, we've got vinyl. Now, the only problem is that vinyl's relatively expensive. Are there ways, and it's not particularly easy for you and I to press a vinyl record. So in terms of capturing audio recording, there were some technological breakthroughs that happened. In the 1940s, we get audio tapes. Audio tapes are a lot easier for us to use as consumers. So you can, while they started off being rather bulky reel-to-reel machines, then you start getting into the fact that people can, in fact, record audio on cassette tapes themselves at home. Home recording becomes a thing. Audio tapes are done with magnetized tape. The only problem with magnetized tape is it can be erased with, magnets. So it is easier than the grooves in a vinyl record to create, but it's also easier to destroy. And until we get to almost 1958, everything is recorded in mono. So for those of you who might listen to music regularly, sometimes you'll see that things are listed as mono or stereo. Stereo allows us to have two different tracks that are recorded separately and then transmitted separately. So when you watch a movie in surround sound and it sounds like something is whizzing behind your head around you, that's 5 tracks generally, sometimes up to 7 tracks of audio that is being passed through different speakers. Prior to 1958, everything was recorded as a single audio track. And so you couldn't have that kind of dynamic sound. Music was recorded, again, that single track. You wouldn't have one thing coming out of your headphones on the right and a different thing coming out of your headphones on your left. We take that for granted these days. But this was a technology that didn't come out until over 100 years after sound recording started. And digital recording, as we know it, our most common way of recording these days, what I'm doing right now, didn't come about until the 1970s. And even then, again, this was when these things emerged. This is when they started becoming a thing. They didn't become mass available to people until later on. So in the 1970s, we start being able to use computers to record, to take down, to commit to digital memory audio. And again, in the 1970s, if you track this against when the internet is becoming an emergence, 1970s is also when we have microprocessors coming out. So people are going to be able to start to have computers that don't take up whole rooms. So the fact that we're able to have computers that are relatively reasonably sized, it makes sense that that's the same time that now there are more people accessing computers. We're going to be able to see a big boom in how we're using computers. So we're going to use them to record audio. Prior to this, all recording is analog. Vinyl is analog. Audio tapes are analog. Phonographs are analog. What analog means is that you have something that physically captures the fluctuation in sound waves. And it's going to store that as either something physical. Either we've got grooves in a record, we have magnetic charges on those tapes, but it's a physical thing. You can go through and physically scratch it out, or you can take a magnet and run it along and physically get rid of it, rather than a digital recording is something that exists only in code. It's something that is just bits on a computer. It doesn't actually physically exist. We can take this digital recording and put it onto an analog medium, such as most vinyl records today are recorded digitally. And then they're going to be pressed into an analog format. But we do the actual recording, mastering, creation in a digital tool, which allows us to manipulate more, to have a higher range of frequencies that we work with than when we're using something that's analog. So remember, analog is physical. CDs kind of bridged this digital analog gap. So when they start in the 1980s, they are something that is digitally recorded. It's a data disc. A CD is data. It's the reason why we have CDRs, DVD-Rs. DVDs and CDs are binary computer programs, they're a program that are then read and translated into music and video. But you can put any kind of data you want on a CD or DVD. It's just that a CD player only understands data that is written in a specific language that it knows how to encode, or decode rather. So they are physical objects you can hold, but the information stored in them is all written in computer code. So it's kind of this bridge between our physical analog media and our digital media. So that's happening in the 1980s as we're starting to get into the internet becoming a mass medium, computers becoming a mass medium. We're starting to have things like CDs become mass medium. And to be perfectly honest, CDs as ways of distributing music, pretty common in the 90s when I was growing up. When I was a kid, we mostly had, for cost reasons, audio tapes and vinyl. When we get into the 90s, it starts becoming cheaper to get CDs, cheaper to get CD players. They become more common in people's homes. But in terms of like being able to burn our own CDs, that's not normal until the early 2000s. Again, cost-wise, I was able to access that at my mother's college. You know, universities and institutions that have budgets for that had those things. But for you and me, normal people, we didn't have access to that stuff. We were still making mixtapes for each other when I was in high school. And that's how, it wasn't, mixed CDs weren't really popular until the beginning of the 2000s. And obviously now we just make playlists. So in 1992, as we're getting the internet to be a mass medium, we are getting dial-up connection into most people's homes, and we're starting to get broadband. We have this convergence of technology. So we are digitally recording music on computers. Usually we're then taking that and passing that into a physical format, like a CD, or we're pressing it onto an analog media like a tape. But as we're getting the internet into more people's homes, then developers are starting to figure out ways that we can swap these files faster. And so MP3s emerge as a format that is going to become popular. I'll tell you why in a second. And therefore, we start swapping MP3s over the internet. In 2001, we finally get a Supreme Court ruling that says that's illegal, that in fact the intellectual property of the song belongs to the creator, or in many cases, the music label that owns the rights. And so we can't swap those things for free. During the heady days of early file sharing, one of the biggest issues was that no one wanted to pay what it cost to buy a CD in the store or tape in the store because they were relatively expensive at, most music stores. iTunes, Apple was very savvy in finding a price point that people were willing to pay. It had to be a small enough price, but that they were then able to take enough of a cut for themselves to make it worth their while, but they could pass on enough money to the labels to make them buy in. And so that's where we get our model for legal music downloading. They figured out how to do it in a large enough bulk to kind of make it worth their while and make it worth the while of the music industry. They found proprietary ways to put rights management software into their music files so that I couldn't buy a song and just put it on the iPod of a friend without it being linked to my account. Because before that, we were using MP3s. MP3 is the audio layer which is the third layer, for a MPEG. An MPEG is a video codec. If you take video production, I'm sure you will hear all about codecs. So it's basically stripping the audio out of a video file. But what was really nice about this particular file is that it was both small but relatively high fidelity. Previously, we've had all kinds of different audio formats, but a lot of them were really, really large in order to preserve all the data. And so you couldn't really swap that over the internet. It would take you about 2 days to download a WAV file. Or the audio quality was so poor, well, no, I'm going to listen to the CD. But MP3s were small enough, but the trade-off in fidelity wasn't so high that people didn't want to share it via dial-up. So it's still used today. There are other file formats that might do a better job or higher quality files in terms of audio, FLAC files and OGG files and all those kind of things that people who are audio heads will be really into. And you have lots of proprietary file formats like the ones that Apple uses to make sure that people can't swap outside of your account. But we still do use MP3s. If you buy things off of Bandcamp, you download as MP3s a lot of the time unless you're getting FLACs. And in terms of how this shaped the recording industry, it was absolutely massive. As you can see in, less than 20 years, the amount of sales that were digital downloads versus CDs. I mean, just look at CD shares shrink. 1999 to 2011 is a little bit more than 10 years. It's 12 years. But it goes from 88% to 44%. It's cut in half. Meanwhile, digital downloads weren't even a thing in terms of market share in 1999. Then it's also interesting to see vinyl growing. But 12 years later, you've got CDs in half. And then another 6 years later, they go from 44% to less than half again. They're not even 22%, they're 17% in 2017. And 65% is streaming, which was barely a thing in 2011, and ends up cutting about half of digital downloads share out. So we'll talk a little bit later about what that means in terms of ownership, what that means in terms of the share that artists get, a little bit later on, but just to see how the shift, the convergence, has radically rewritten the kind of way that we purchase, buy, listen to music. So, as you can see, most of us listen to streaming music more than anything else, which means that we don't physically own, digitally or analog, the music we listen to. We do usually pay some kind of subscription fee to get access, but if I stopped my Spotify subscription, I would lose access to a whole lot of my music. And in fact, I have a hard drive with a backup of all the music I've bought, all the CDs I've bought that have been ripped onto my hard drive. But I don't use that nearly as much anymore because I can more easily get access to my music through Spotify. In terms of timeline, when we were showing you that, those services weren't really a thing at, 1999, 6 years later, 2005, Pandora comes along. At that point, people weren't really paying for Pandora. Spotify started up in Sweden, I believe. It was definitely a Nordic country, in 2006. When I moved to the UK in 2010, most of my friends had Spotify, but it was still it was the in thing to have. In 2009, I think it was still you had to be invited in. I think it might have still been that in 2010. I think I had to get someone to send me an invite code in 2010 when I moved there. But in 2011, it launched in the US. So that was a really big boom in terms of its reach. And most people kind of did the free version at first, but they, again, priced it at a point that wasn't so high that people didn't want to pay for the convenience. And so it's so convenient that I still will buy things on Bandcamp to support musicians that I want to make sure the money goes directly to them. But for a lot of people, they use Spotify to access the majority of the music that they listen to. So this has really completely reshaped the landscape in terms of when we talk about emergence entrepreneurial and how people are making money and using money as a driving force for a mass medium. It's completely reshaped that landscape and upset the apple cart. We'll get to talking about the music industry a little bit later and how they want to kind of keep their control over the money flow. But by changing how access has kind of flowed through, it's allowed a resurgence with independent labels and independent music creators to kind of get back in at that ground floor in a way that was very hard to do when access to analog recording equipment was kind of cost prohibitive. And I just want to end this section on a note that digital streaming is not the first time that there's been a disruption to the music industry. In the 1920s, radio becomes much more of a common household thing. We'll talk about the growth of radio and TV and all that in another chapter. But in the 1920s, radio becomes more of a home thing that people have, and record sales are going to drop precipitously. And so this is just another example of the music industry responding to a change in the medium around it. So ASCAP was established as a way of getting rights from radio play. And again, we're going to have disruption again in the 1950s when we have TV. And royalties again are becoming an issue when we have streaming. So these are all areas and times when we start having a change in how we access. And then the industry is going to have to race to find a way to kind of get back ahead. And in terms of ASCAP, what I find interesting is that for a musician, the majority of the money you make off of your music is from what's called publishing. It's not from physical sales of your music. It's not from digital downloads. It's not from streaming. It's mostly going to be through these rights. And so if you're played on the radio, you get that publishing money through ASCAP. There are equivalents in the UK and Europe of the various rights companies. But this is why it matters. We'll talk a little bit about how the money's distributed. This is why it matters who's listed as writing the song versus just performing it. As if you are one of the people who wrote the song, therefore you are in charge of the intellectual property, you get much, much more money. Most of the times that stuff is, if you're an emerging artist, the music company will make sure you get less of a cut. And so you will need to make more money off of touring and things like that. But if you are an established artist and you get those licensing fees, that's where a majority of your money is going to come from. We'll talk a little bit more about that later.